So I'm here with Zohra Khaku, and Zhora is the director of the Muslim Youth Helpline. How are you this morning?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm all right, I'm fine. What is the mission of the Muslim Youth Helpline?
So the Muslim Youth Helpline is there to support young people with emotional difficulties and mental health issues. And we do that in three ways. We have a telephone helpline, we do that by email and web chat. So we are non-judgmental, but faith and culturally sensitive.
And what kind of services does the MYH make available to young people?
So people call us or inquire, and we do a lot of basic counselling things. So things like active listening, trying to help people understand what they're feeling. So we provide that support, but we also do a lot of signposting. So if someone needs a bit more serious mental health support, for example, if they call with an eating disorder, we might refer them to an eating disorder organisation. So if they need specialist help or professional counselling, we refer them on to that.
And what are the common issues and challenges that young Muslims tend to contact you about?
Well, that's an interesting one, because if you look at the most frequent inquiries we get, it's kind of the bread and butter of mental health. So I like to think that young Muslims have the same issues as young non-Muslims. They just have the added faith and culturally sensitive baggage that comes with who they are. So, so the top three issues would be all mental health related. So depression, anxiety and exam stress would be the top three. But the interesting thing, I think, is looking at issues that are also on the rise. So they might not be as common, but for example, this year in June, fully half of our inquiries were about pornography addiction. And I think the more interesting thing about that was that half were from boys and men and half were from girls and women. And it's quite interesting because even within the community, we've got lots of places to send young men who have that issue, but not that many to send young women. And it's an issue that people aren't really talking about. So we find that part of our job really is going back into the community and saying, hey community, we've got to think about these issues and how to support young people going through this, because it's a bit of a taboo talking about them.
So it's a circular sort of thing in which you're picking up on new issues as they rise and as they change and as they grow, and then feeding back into community leaders and parents in that community that, look, this is an issue in our community.
Absolutely.
What are we going to do? What other services do we need to provide?
And we
young
do
people?
a lot of that sort of community outreach where we go into communities and talk about things like, I mean, sometimes quite generic things like, how do you talk to teenagers? There's a lot of parents and teachers who are really quite mystified by that. So what we do is, because we kind of have access to the front line of youth, we kind of take their issues and take them back to the community and say, so for example, a couple of years ago, it was sexual abuse, and we had a real focus on that and said, okay, well, let's try and understand it. Let's try and think about what happens to victims of sexual abuse afterwards. You know, you might have someone who's 12 now, and how do you deal with that to make sure that they're a functioning adult? And so we did workshops on that, workshops on things like active listening, trying to understand young people, what the issues are in the first place. Because I think sometimes people think it's things, you know, that they think are quite mundane, like bullying. And bullying is a huge issue, but it's not the only issue. So I think for us, it's about saying, well, actually, you know, you may only see a young person at the mosque if you're a Sunday school teacher, for example, but they have this whole life where things like pornography addiction, depression, stress, anxiety are all big issues for that kid.
And they may not be happy talking to you within the context of the mosque about those issues.
Absolutely.
Do your counsellors tend to be quite young themselves? They tend to be youngish people themselves?
Yeah, I think the whole ethos really is a bit of a peer listening thing. So I think our youngest counsellor or advisor is 18, and they go right the way up into their 30s, but generally they're still young. But generally they're in their sort of early 20s, and I think that's mainly because they understand they've sort of been through those issues themselves, and they're looking for a way to kind of give back.
Fantastic. Yeah. And are there, you mentioned this, the rise in perhaps pornography addiction, both in girls and boys in the Muslim community, as is the case across all communities. Yeah. Are there any other differences? Are there differences in terms of the issues that men and women or young men and women are reporting to you?
Well, it's really interesting to see our interaction with men and women, because when we go and deliver workshops and things, we find probably less than 25% of the attendees are men. But on the helpline itself, for example, this month, 50% of our inquiries were from men. They do need the help. They just may not be able to, you know, attend a workshop that's about mental health to help them improve their well-being beforehand. So what we're trying to do is look at some initiatives that look at preventative well-being And so that's kind of a focus that we've got in terms of men, just to kind of help them to open up and help them to be able to talk about it. And I think partly that comes down to role models and things like influencers being able to say, actually, I'm a young Muslim man and I have XYZ issues, and kind of normalizing it a little bit. But in terms of what they call about, it's actually pretty similar. Again, with the sort of depression, suicidal thoughts, those sorts, and stress, those sorts of things. And actually, just recently, we had one of our, I think potentially our first case of a man who was suffering domestic violence. And it's great that people can actually call up and talk about those things.
And what are the most common pathways that young people then take following? So they've called you up, they're seeking support. What are the most common pathways that then, where do they go next? What are you referring them on to, or what are the most common routes they then take?
So some of the people who call the helpline will just need that sort of listening ear, and they may call once, they may call a few times over a few weeks, or even once a year when they feel like it. So sometimes that's all they need. So that's one thing. But in terms of referring on, sometimes I think probably the most common referral we make is to professional counselling. And that's for someone that needs, for example, CBT or something like that, a course of almost treatment, I guess. GPs also, so especially when it comes to things like depression, actually people do need to go and see their GPs and take it quite seriously. And apart from that, I think it would be just specialist helplines. So, for example, the eating disorders helpline and things like that.
And are there, do you think, are there enough services to refer into for young Muslim men and women, or enough services that maybe understand the cultural sensitivities or the cultural context that young people have come from, that are available?
That's an interesting question.
Do mainstream health services, are they sufficiently sensitive and knowledgeable about some of the cultural issues that young Muslim men and women are
I'm going to say no. So I do think, so whether there are enough services in general, I think is a huge topic that I think everyone in the mental health sector is thinking about. Is, do we have enough counsellors? Do people have enough access in general? Are young people able to reach out? And when they do reach out, if you go to your GP, for example, how long is it till you actually hear from someone who's going to be able to help you? So those, I think, are just general to the sector. But then in terms of mainstream services understanding the kind of faith and culturally sensitive part of where a young Muslim might be coming from, I think that's something we still need to work on. So I know that people are trying to work on it. We're certainly trying to work on it in terms of speaking to organisations in the NHS and counselling services that are for youth and things like that, and building those relationships and kind of helping them to understand what it might be and what the differences in culture and faith might be. But I think it's going to take some time. I think it's sort of slow going. There's just so much need, and it's just barrier upon barrier, and it's sort of trying to break those down one by one, which is quite hard.
So moving away from this sort of one-size-fits-all approach to how mental health services are delivered and structured.
Absolutely, and I think in a perfect world, it's not about, I don't think there need to be separate services for Muslims at all. No. I think it's just about mainstream services, just understanding how to deal with someone who comes from that background. It's
about that individual who's tasked with that counselling, who is that counsellor, and is involved in that talking therapy, just having that understanding of where someone's coming from.
Absolutely, I think that's just a matter of training.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think there are traditions and teachings in the Islamic faith that are ever in conflict with an understanding of mental health issues, or any kind of obstacle to young people seeking and receiving the support they might need?
So that's also an interesting question. So I think faith can be helpful sometimes when it comes to mental health. So some people find solace in things like prayer or reflection or meditation and those sorts of things. Prayer in particular, I think people find quite useful. There are lots of traditions, hadith and traditions and sayings of the Prophet that talk about looking after yourself, looking after others, giving, those sorts of things, and supporting each other. So I think those traditions are quite clear about if someone's in trouble or in distress, it's almost your duty to help them out and to help them understand what's going on. So that's a positive aspect of it. I think sometimes it can also be negative. So to give you two examples, one is we hear sometimes about people who have mental health issues or a certain kind of psychosis being told that they've been possessed by a jinn. which is a kind of what's difficult to explain really, but they just feel that they've been possessed, which means that they're no longer responsible for their actions. And so sometimes they sort of get put into that category of people who've been possessed and kind of left to it, where what they really need is a mental health diagnosis and potentially medication and counselling. So that's one area that it can be quite difficult to understand. So I think the second one can sometimes be a bit of a disparity between where you think you should be spiritually and where you are spiritually. So for example, in Ramadan, when people are fasting, we sometimes get calls from people saying, well, I'm fasting and I'm praying and I don't feel any closer to God. And does that mean I have a hole in my soul, and having a bit of a spiritual crisis about those sorts of things? So we deal with those sorts of issues too.
What about issues about, for example, LGBT youngsters maybe in the community? Are there specific issues there? Is that one that you get calls about?
We do. We get calls from young people talking about their sexuality on all different, I suppose, ends of the spectrum in terms of the difficulty of the issue. So sometimes it's, oh, I think I might be gay and I'm not really sure and I'm sort of thinking about things, all the way through to, well, I had sex with someone from the same gender last night and I don't know what that means, through to parents even calling and saying, well, you know, my son or daughter says that they're gay. What do I do with that? So we do get calls around sexuality, and I think what our approach to that really is the same as any other issue that young people will call us about. Firstly, we don't judge, so we don't judge people for what they've done or what they haven't done. So because we're confidential and non-judgmental, I think that's why people can talk to us about these sorts of things. And so we'll work through with them how they feel about it, you know, where they are in their lives, what it means to them, all of those sorts of things.
Is there anything else you want to tell us about the work of MYH? Anything that you, if you were trying to encourage a young person from the community to who might be struggling in whatever way to give you a call, what would you say to them?
The first thing I'd say is that our service is completely confidential and completely non-judgmental. So whatever you're going through, we're there to help you out. And if we feel that you need any more professional help, we'll help you get it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Zora.
Thank
It's great
you.
to speak to you this morning.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.